The sky over Boston that evening hung heavy with the smell of rain and anticipation. I remember glancing at the rolling clouds above, their slate-gray bellies bruised with darker shades, as I followed Elliot Brooks down the cobblestone street. The lanterns, lining the historic pathway of the Freedom Trail, flickered softly, their light casting shadows that danced like restless ghosts across the ancient brick walls. Even in the quiet, I could hear the echo of history here, the protests, the footsteps, the voices of those who had walked this path before us. And tonight, it felt as though we were walking directly into one of those echoes. Elliot walked briskly ahead of me, his trench coat rippling behind him. He was a man of sharp angles, both in appearance and thought. His eyes, icy blue and perpetually scanning, missed nothing. His movements were economical, deliberate. Even now, I could see the tension in the set of his shoulders. He hadn't spoken much since we'd left the gathering earlier that evening. That was always his way when something was gnawing at his mind, and after all these years, I knew better than to prod. The rally had been vibrant, alive with voices calling for change, for justice. Daniel Carter, the organizer and figurehead of the local civil rights movement, had been the centerpiece of it all. His booming voice had filled the plaza, a voice that could turn the weight of despair into something defiant, something hopeful. Yet, even amidst the cheers and the raised fists, Elliot had seemed uneasy. Perhaps it was the undercurrent of tension in the air, or the way certain figures lingered in the shadows at the edges of the crowd. Now, as we approached the Old North Church, where Daniel had invited a smaller group of us for a private meeting, that unease felt almost palpable. "Something's off," Elliot muttered, more to himself than to me, as we reached the church steps. His voice, clipped and low, sent a shiver down my spine. I stepped closer to him, suddenly aware of the surrounding quiet. The heavy wooden door creaked open under Elliot's hand, revealing the dimly lit interior of the church. The scent of aged wood and candle wax filled the air, mingling with the faint trace of rain that had begun to fall outside. At first glance, everything appeared as it should. The rows of pews were empty, their polished surfaces gleaming faintly in the muted light. Shadows pooled in the corners, where the flickering candlelight couldn't quite reach. But then I saw it, a figure slumped over near the altar, partially obscured by the high-backed chair beside it. My stomach turned, and instinctively, I reached out to steady myself against the edge of the nearest pew. "Stay here," Elliot commanded, his voice steely. He moved swiftly but cautiously, his eyes scanning every inch of the space as he approached the figure. I followed despite his warning, my curiosity and concern overriding my better judgment. As we drew closer, the figure came into focus. It was Daniel. His once commanding presence now seemed diminished, crumpled against the unforgiving stone floor. A pool of blood had spread beneath him, dark and viscous, seeping into the cracks between the tiles. His hand was outstretched, fingers curled as though reaching for something just beyond his grasp. His eyes, glassy and unseeing, stared upward toward the vaulted ceiling. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. Daniel Carter, the man who had stood so tall just hours ago, was gone. My mind reeled, racing to make sense of the sight before me. Elliot knelt beside the body, his expression unreadable. His fingers, gloved as always, moved with precision as he examined the scene. I forced myself to look away, instead focusing on the room around us. Something about this place felt wrong. That's when I noticed it, the marks on the floor. Faint, almost imperceptible scratches leading away from the altar, as though something heavy had been dragged across the stone. "Elliot," I whispered, gesturing toward the marks. He followed my gaze, his sharp eyes narrowing as he took in the details. "Good catch, Miguel," he murmured. Rising to his feet, he began to follow the trail, motioning for me to stay behind. I hesitated but ultimately obeyed, knowing that my presence could potentially compromise whatever evidence he was seeking. I lingered near the altar, my gaze falling on the notebook that lay just beyond Daniel's outstretched hand. The cover was smeared with blood, but it was unmistakably his, a battered leather journal he was never seen without. Tentatively, I picked it up, careful not to disturb the scene more than necessary. The pages inside were filled with Daniel's sprawling handwriting, a mix of speech drafts, meeting notes, and something else. A series of symbols and codes that I couldn't immediately decipher. My heart quickened. This was more than just a personal journal. This was a key, perhaps to understanding why someone would want Daniel dead. Before I could delve further, Elliot returned, his expression grim. "No signs of the killer," he said, his voice low. "But the marks lead to a side door, likely their escape route." I handed him the journal, pointing out the coded entries. His eyes flicked over the pages, his brow furrowing in concentration. "Interesting," he muttered. "We'll need to take a closer look at this." As he spoke, the sound of footsteps echoed through the church. Both of us froze, our senses immediately on high alert. Elliot's hand moved instinctively toward his coat, where I knew he kept a weapon hidden. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until a figure emerged from the shadows. It was Father O'Connor, the church's aging priest. His face was pale, his eyes wide with shock as he took in the scene before him. What happened here?" he stammered, his voice trembling. Elliot stepped forward, his tone measured but firm. "Father, we need you to remain calm. Tell us, did you see anyone enter or leave the church tonight?" The priest shook his head, his hands trembling as they clutched the edge of his robe. "No, no one. I was in the rectory. I heard nothing." I studied the man carefully, noting the genuine distress etched into his features. He didn't strike me as someone capable of orchestrating such violence, but I knew better than to dismiss anyone outright. Elliot, too, seemed to be weighing the priest's demeanor, his piercing gaze never wavering. "We'll need to speak with you further," Elliot said finally. "For now, stay here. Don't touch anything." Father O'Connor nodded, sinking onto one of the pews as though his legs might give out beneath him. I couldn't help but feel a pang of sympathy for the man. This church, so steeped in history and reverence, had been defiled in the worst possible way. As Elliot and I stepped outside into the rain, the weight of the evening settled heavily on my shoulders. The city around us seemed oblivious to the tragedy that had just unfolded within its heart. The faint hum of passing cars and the distant murmur of voices on the street felt almost surreal, a stark contrast to the grim reality we had just witnessed. Elliot's jaw was set, his eyes fixed ahead as though already piecing together the fragments of this puzzle. I could see the wheels turning in his mind, could almost hear the questions forming. Who had killed Daniel Carter? And more importantly, why? For me, the answers seemed as elusive as the whispers of the past that lingered in the air around us. But one thing was certain, this was only the beginning. The patter of the rain against the windows had faded to a soft rhythm by the time Elliot and I sat huddled in his office. The darkness outside was tempered only by the occasional beam of headlights sweeping across the walls as cars passed on the narrow street below. Inside, the low hum of the desk lamp cast a warm glow over the battered journal spread open before us. Despite the physical distance we'd put between ourselves and the Old North Church, its oppressive atmosphere seemed to linger in the room, like the faint smell of blood staining the pages. Elliot leaned forward, his elbows pressed to the edge of the desk as he studied the coded entries on the page. His fingers traced the faint outlines of the geometric shapes Daniel Carter had scribbled, along with cryptic annotations that defied easy interpretation. Meanwhile, I sat across from him, a steaming mug of coffee in my hand, trying to piece together my own fragmented impressions of the night's events. "I've seen these symbols somewhere before," Elliot muttered, his voice like gravel scraping against the tense silence. "They're too structured to be random. They follow a sequence almost mathematical in nature." I shifted in my seat, the warmth of the coffee failing to chase away the chill embedded deep in my chest. "Could it be some kind of cipher?" I asked, my own thoughts echoing his observation. "Something tied to the movements Daniel was researching?" Elliot didn't respond right away, his eyes narrowing as his mind worked furiously behind his stoic expression. He was a man of precision, and though his martial arts expertise was often lauded, it was his mastery of mental combat that truly set him apart. Tonight was no exception. His sharp observational skills cut through the labyrinth of possibilities quicker than anyone I'd ever known. Finally, he exhaled sharply and leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking under his weight. "It's possible, but we're missing too many pieces. Without a key, it's all conjecture." I frowned, glancing at the journal. The weight of Daniel's death seemed heavier now, as though it hung over both of us with an undeniable urgency. "What about Father O'Connor?" I asked. He seemed rattled, but that crash in the rectory, I can't stop thinking about it. Elliot's gaze shifted to me, his icy blue eyes piercing through the haze of my thoughts. "You think he knows more than he's letting on?" I hesitated, recalling the priest's trembling demeanor and evasive answers. "I do. Maybe not directly involved, but he's hiding something." There's too much fear in his voice. Elliot nodded slowly, his fingers drumming against the edge of the desk. "We'll need to go back, but not tonight. Let him stew in his own thoughts for a while. People's truths tend to surface when they're left alone with their guilt." His words carried an ominous weight, one I felt all too keenly. Despite the rain tapering off outside, the night still felt heavy with foreboding. I pushed my unease aside and reached for the journal, flipping the pages until I landed on one marked with the faint imprint of Daniel's handwriting. The geometric symbols were clustered tightly together, accompanied by an annotation. "Site B, preservation at risk." "What's Site B?" I asked aloud, pointing at the notation. Elliot's expression darkened, his posture shifting slightly. "Probably one of the community sites Daniel was working to protect." He mentioned several historical landmarks during the rally, places threatened by urban development and corporate expansion. The idea clicked in my mind, aligning with what I'd learned about Daniel's activism. He was relentless in his defense of Boston's cultural and historical heritage, often clashing with developers seeking to capitalize on the city's growth. The term "preservation at risk" carried a sinister undertone now, given the circumstances of his murder. "We need to figure out where Site B is," I said, my voice firm despite the lingering unease. "It could be the key to understanding why Daniel was killed." Elliot grunted in agreement, but before he could respond further, A knock sounded at the door. The sharp, deliberate rhythm sent a jolt through me, and I exchanged a wary glance with Elliot. He rose from his chair with calculated movements, his hand brushing against the concealed holster beneath his coat as he approached the door. When he opened it, a young woman stood in the doorway, her rain-soaked coat clinging to her frame and her dark hair plastered to her face. She looked no older than 25, her wide eyes darting past Elliot and landing on me before she spoke. "Detective Brooks?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "I need your help." Elliot stepped aside, gesturing for her to enter. "Come in," he said, his tone measured but firm. "Who are you?" The woman hesitated as she stepped into the room, her gaze flicking nervously between Elliot and me. "My name is Susan Carter. I'm Daniel's niece." The revelation hit me like a bolt of lightning, and I straightened in my seat, my grip tightening on the mug of coffee. Elliot, ever composed, motioned for her to sit in the chair opposite mine. "What brings you here, Ms. Carter?" he asked, his voice calm but laced with an underlying intensity. "It's a dangerous night to be out alone." Susan's hands trembled as she fidgeted with the buttons of her coat. "I had nowhere else to go," she said, her voice cracking under the weight of her words. "After Uncle Daniel was killed, I found something at his apartment. I don't know who to trust, but I heard about you through his friends." I leaned forward, my curiosity piqued. "What did you find?" I asked, unable to hide the urgency in my tone. Susan reached into her bag and pulled out a folder, its edges worn and slightly stained. She handed it to Elliot, who flipped through its contents with meticulous care. Inside were several documents, meeting agendas, handwritten notes, and newspaper clippings, all centered around the same theme: the preservation of Boston's historical sites. But one paper in particular caught Elliot's attention. He held it up to the light, his sharp eyes scanning the text. It was a typed memorandum, stamped with the letterhead of a prominent Boston corporation. "Urban Renewal Initiative," Elliot read aloud, his voice devoid of emotion. "Proposed acquisition and redevelopment of selected landmarks. Priority sites include..." He trailed off, his gaze darkening. "Site B." Susan flinched at his tone, her own fear bubbling to the surface. "Uncle Daniel was convinced they were hiding something," she said, her words spilling out in a rush. "He thought they were falsifying reports to justify demolishing the sites. I think this is why they killed him." Elliot didn't respond right away, his mind clearly working through the implications. Meanwhile, I felt a surge of anger building within me. Anger at the greed and corruption that had likely led to Daniel's murder. "This changes things," Elliot finally said, his voice low. "Who else knows about these documents?" Susan shook her head. "No one. I didn't show them to anyone. Not even the police." I exchanged a glance with Elliot, the weight of her revelation settling heavily between us. This was bigger than we'd anticipated, and the stakes were higher than ever. As the rain began to pick up again outside, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being pulled into a battle that was far from over. The night wore on with an oppressive silence as Elliot and I remained in his office, poring over the documents Susan Carter had brought us. The rain outside had thinned to a light drizzle, but the faint tapping of droplets against the window added to the weight of unease that settled heavily in the room. Across the desk, Elliot's sharp blue eyes flickered with intensity, darting between the memorandum and Daniel's blood-stained journal, as though willing the pieces to come together. Susan sat curled in the chair to my left, her thin frame tucked into her coat as though she were trying to make herself small. Her dark eyes, so much like her uncle's, scanned the room nervously, her fingers fidgeting with the strap of her bag. I couldn't tell if it was the lingering shock of Daniel's murder or the fear of what might come next that kept her so tense. Either way, I felt a pang of sympathy for her. She was young, too young to carry the weight of this tragedy. "I don't like it," Elliot muttered, breaking the quiet. He leaned back in his chair, tapping the pencil against the edge of the desk. "The more I look at this, the less sense it makes. What doesn't add up?" I asked, leaning forward with my elbows on the desk. The coffee I'd nursed for hours sat forgotten in front of me, now cold and bitter. Elliot gestured toward the memorandum. "This Urban Renewal Initiative. On the surface, it's a standard redevelopment proposal, a justification for bulldozing historic landmarks to make way for new corporate developments. But look at the language here." He pointed to a line of text. "Priority sites include locations identified as critical to community preservation efforts." That's bureaucratic doublespeak if I've ever seen it. I frowned, the weight of his words settling over me like a lead blanket. So they're targeting these sites intentionally. But why? Elliot's gaze darkened, and his jaw tightened. Leverage. These sites aren't just historic, they're symbolic. Destroying them sends a message, and that message is one of control. My guess is Daniel uncovered more than just the memorandum. He found evidence, something that proved these corporations were acting outside the law. That's why they silenced him. A chill ran down my spine at his conclusion. It wasn't a stretch. Boston had long been a battleground of old money and new power, where history and progress often collided in ways that left scars on the city and its people. But now those scars felt deeper, more sinister. Susan cleared her throat, her voice trembling as she finally spoke. "Uncle Daniel was always so careful," she said softly. "He wouldn't have kept something like that in plain sight. If he had proof, it would be somewhere safe." Elliot's eyes shifted to her, his expression unreadable. "Any idea where that might be?" he asked, his tone as sharp as the edge of a blade. Susan hesitated, her brow furrowing as she searched her memory. There's his storage unit," she said finally. "He kept some of his research there, old files, documents he didn't want anyone else to see. But I don't know if it's still there." He was always paranoid about being followed. Elliot nodded, the gears in his mind clearly turning. "Where's the unit?" he asked. "South End," she replied. He didn't trust big storage companies, so he rented from a friend who runs a warehouse. Without another word, Elliot rose from his chair and grabbed his coat. His movements were swift, deliberate, and they set the tone for the rest of us. I pushed myself to my feet, suppressing the nagging ache of exhaustion that tugged at my limbs. Whatever lay in that storage unit, it could very well be the key to understanding why Daniel had been killed, and who was responsible. The warehouse was a hulking silhouette against the night sky, its brick facade worn and weathered by years of neglect. The South End was eerily quiet at this hour, the streets deserted save for the occasional flicker of light from a distant window. I shivered against the cold as I followed Elliot and Susan toward the rusted metal door, my breath clouding the air in front of me. "This is it," Susan said, her voice barely above a whisper. She fished a set of keys from her bag and handed them to Elliot, her hand trembling as she did so. Elliot gave her a curt nod before slipping the key into the lock. The mechanism groaned in protest, but after a moment it gave way, and the door creaked open to reveal the dim interior of the warehouse. The air inside was stale, heavy with the scent of dust and mildew. Rows of wooden crates and metal shelves stretched into the shadows, their contents obscured by tarps and years of neglect. "Stay close," Elliot instructed, his voice low and steady as he stepped inside. I followed closely, my senses on high alert. The silence was almost oppressive, broken only by the faint sound of our footsteps on the concrete floor. Susan led us toward the back of the warehouse, where a row of smaller storage units lined the wall. She stopped in front of one marked with a faded number 7, her breath hitching slightly as she gestured toward it. "This is it," she said. Elliot moved forward, his hand instinctively brushing the edge of his coat where I knew he kept a small revolver concealed. He examined the lock carefully before using the key to open it. The metal door slid upward with a screech, revealing the contents of the unit. Inside were stacks of cardboard boxes, neatly labeled with dates and shorthand notations. A folding table sat against the back wall, cluttered with old photographs, rolled-up maps, and a manual typewriter. It was a historian's treasure trove, a testament to Daniel's meticulous nature and unwavering dedication to his cause. Elliot began sifting through the boxes with practiced efficiency, his sharp eyes scanning each label before moving to the next. I joined him, my own curiosity driving me to dig deeper into the trove of information. Susan lingered near the entrance, her arms wrapped tightly around herself as though warding off an unseen chill. As I rummaged through one of the boxes, my fingers brushed against something cold and metallic. I pulled it out to reveal a small tape recorder, its surface scuffed but otherwise intact. A cassette tape was still inside, labeled in Daniel's handwriting, asterisk, Site B, evidence, asterisk. "Elliot," I said, holding up the recorder. His head snapped up, his gaze locking onto the device in my hand. He took it from me, his expression grave as he inspected the tape. "This might be what we're looking for," he said. "Let's see what Daniel left us." He pressed play, and the recorder whirred to life. Static crackled for a moment before a familiar voice filled the air. It was Daniel, his tone measured but laced with urgency. "If you're listening to this, it means they've gotten to me," his voice began, sending a shiver down my spine. "But the truth can't die with me. Site B is more than just a landmark. It's a symbol of the power they're trying to erase. And I've found proof of their crimes." The recording continued, Daniel detailing the corruption he had uncovered, bribes, falsified documents, and plans to demolish the site under the guise of urban renewal. He named names, exposing the powerful figures behind the conspiracy, their motives laid bare for anyone willing to listen. But before the tape could finish, a loud crash echoed through the warehouse, shattering the fragile tension. My heart leapt into my throat as Elliot reached for his revolver, his eyes scanning the shadows. "We're not alone," he said, his voice a harsh whisper. I glanced at Susan, whose face had gone pale with fear. "Stay behind us," I instructed, my own pulse racing as I moved to follow Elliot's lead. The sound of footsteps echoed through the cavernous space, deliberate and unhurried. Whoever was out there wanted us to know they were coming. And as the darkness closed in around us, I couldn't shake the feeling that the battle for truth was only just beginning. The echo of the crash reverberated through the warehouse, cutting through the suffocating silence like a knife. I instinctively turned toward the sound, my breath catching in my throat. Elliot's hand shot to his revolver, his movements sharp and deliberate as he shifted into a defensive stance. His silhouette, framed by the dim light spilling in from the small window, exuded an unshakable presence that steadied my rising panic. Susan whimpered softly behind me, her hands clutching her coat as if it could shield her from whatever danger lurked in the shadows. I placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, though my own nerves were fraying with every passing second. The warehouse, with its looming shelves and dark recesses, suddenly felt alive with the weight of unseen eyes. "Stay here," Elliot said, his voice a low growl. His gaze darted toward me, and I nodded in silent understanding. Without hesitation, he began moving toward the source of the noise, his footsteps eerily silent on the concrete floor. I swallowed hard and turned to Susan. "Don't move," I whispered, though my voice wavered despite my effort to sound composed. She nodded, her wide eyes locked on mine as if seeking an anchor in the chaos. The moments stretched into what felt like an eternity as Elliot disappeared into the shadows. I strained my ears, listening for any sign of what, or who, might be waiting for him in the depths of the warehouse. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat louder than the last, until I was sure it would give away our position. A sudden scuffle broke the silence, followed by the unmistakable sound of something heavy toppling over. The crash echoed through the space, and my pulse quickened as I instinctively stepped forward. "Elliot," I called out, unable to keep the fear from my voice. "Stay back." His voice rang out, sharp and commanding, but before I could process his warning, a shadow emerged from the aisle ahead. My stomach lurched as I saw the figure, a man dressed in dark clothing, his face obscured by the brim of a cap. He moved with practiced efficiency, his steps purposeful as he made a beeline for the exit. "Stop!" I shouted, adrenaline surging through me as I stepped into his path. But he didn't stop, he didn't even hesitate. Instead, he barreled toward me with the force of a freight train, knocking me off balance and sending me sprawling to the ground. The impact drove the air from my lungs, and I gasped, scrambling to regain my footing. By the time I looked up, the man was already at the door, shoving it open and disappearing into the night. Elliot appeared beside me in an instant, his revolver still drawn as he helped me to my feet. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his eyes scanning me for any signs of injury. I shook my head, though my ribs ached from the fall. "I'm fine," I managed, my voice strained. "Who was that?" Elliot's jaw tightened, and he holstered his weapon with a frustrated sigh. "Someone who didn't want us finding what we came here for." Susan stepped forward hesitantly, her face pale as she looked between us. Did he take something?" she asked, her voice trembling. Elliot didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned his attention back to the storage unit, his sharp gaze sweeping over its contents. "Help me check," he said, his tone curt but not unkind. Together, the three of us sifted through the boxes, searching for anything that might be missing or out of place. My hands shook as I sorted through stacks of papers and photographs, my mind racing with the implications of what had just happened. Whoever that man was, he'd risked exposure to intercept us. That meant whatever Daniel had uncovered was far more dangerous than I'd imagined. "It's gone," Elliot said finally, his voice grim. He held up the recorder, the cassette tape missing from its slot. He took the tape. My stomach sank at the realization. That tape had been our strongest lead, a direct link to the conspiracy Daniel had uncovered. Without it, we were back to square one. Susan let out a choked sob, her hands covering her face as she sank to the floor. "What do we do now?" she whispered, her voice muffled by her trembling fingers. Elliot crouched beside her, his expression softening slightly. "We keep going," he said firmly. "This isn't over." She looked up at him, her tear-streaked face illuminated by the faint light. "But how? Without the tape. Daniel left us more than just that," I interjected, holding up one of the documents I'd been examining. It was a blueprint of some sort, marked with the same geometric symbols we'd seen in the journal. "There's still a trail to follow. We just have to figure out where it leads." Elliot nodded, his sharp eyes meeting mine with a glimmer of approval. "He's right. This isn't the end. It's just another obstacle." I wanted to believe him, but the weight of the night pressed heavily on me, sapping my strength and resolve. Still, I knew I couldn't give up. Not now, not when so much was at stake. As we left the warehouse, the chill of the night air bit at my skin, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The city around us seemed to hold its breath, the shadows deeper and more menacing than before. Elliot walked ahead, his posture tense and his hand resting on the hilt of his revolver. Susan clung to my side, her steps faltering as if the weight of her grief threatened to pull her to the ground. When we finally reached the street, Elliot turned to face us, his expression as stoic as ever. "We need to move quickly," he said. "Whoever that man was, he'll report back to someone, and they won't take kindly to us poking around." I nodded, though my thoughts were still scattered. "Where do we start?" Elliot held up the blueprint I'd found. "Here," he said, pointing to a location marked with one of the symbols. "This might be Site B." Susan's eyes widened as she looked at the map. "That's the old printing press downtown," she said. "Daniel used to talk about it all the time. He said it was one of the most important landmarks in the city." Elliot's jaw tightened. "Then that's where we go next," he said. "But we'll need to be careful. Whoever's behind this won't let us walk in unchallenged." The weight of his words hung heavily in the air as we started down the empty street. The city around us felt darker, more foreboding than ever, as though it too knew the dangers that lay ahead. And yet, despite the fear gnawing at my resolve, I couldn't turn away, because in that moment, I understood something that Elliot had likely known all along. Truth was worth fighting for, no matter the cost. The morning light crept through the thin veil of mist that blanketed Boston, softening the edges of the city's skyline. Yet, the damp chill in the air did little to calm my frayed nerves. I sat in the passenger seat of Elliot's car, fidgeting with my coat as we approached our destination. The old printing press Daniel Carter had fought so fiercely to preserve. The streets were quiet this early, lending an almost ethereal quality to the journey. It felt as though the city itself was holding its breath, waiting for what might come next. Elliot's hands gripped the steering wheel with calm intensity, his knuckles pale but steady. He hadn't said much since we left the warehouse, but his silence spoke volumes. His focus was razor-sharp, his mind undoubtedly piecing together the fragments of a puzzle that had only grown more complex. I, on the other hand, couldn't stop my thoughts from spiraling. The events of the previous night played on a loop in my mind. The shadowy figure in the warehouse, the stolen tape, Susan's trembling voice as she recounted her uncle's warnings. "You're too quiet," Elliot said suddenly, breaking the silence. His voice, low and even, carried a faint undercurrent of concern. I glanced at him, startled. "Just thinking," I admitted, "about the tape, about Daniel, about everything." He nodded, his gaze never leaving the road. "We'll find answers, Miguel, but we need to stay sharp. Whoever we're dealing with, they're playing a dangerous game." As we pulled up to the printing press, I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. The building loomed before us, its brick facade weathered by decades of exposure to the elements. Tall windows, some cracked or boarded up, lined the upper floors, and a faded sign above the entrance read, Evergreen Printing Company. It was a relic of another time, a testament to Boston's industrial past, and now, perhaps, a battleground for its future. Elliot parked the car a short distance away, deliberately choosing a spot that afforded us a clear view of the building while keeping us concealed. He cut the engine and turned to me, his expression unreadable. "Stay close," he said, his voice firm, "and keep your eyes open." I nodded, pulling my scarf tighter around my neck as I stepped out into the crisp morning air. Susan had stayed behind, too shaken from the previous night to accompany us. Part of me was relieved. Her presence would have only added to the tension, but I couldn't help feeling a pang of guilt for leaving her alone. I pushed the thought aside as we approached the entrance to the printing press. The door was locked, as we had expected, but Elliot made quick work of it with a set of lockpicks he always seemed to have on hand. The skill was yet another reminder of the man's many talents. Talents that, on occasion, made me question just how far his moral boundaries stretched. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of dust and ink, a combination that instantly transported me back to my childhood in Mexico, where my father had worked in a small print shop. The faint hum of forgotten machinery and the faint creak of wooden floorboards under our feet added to the eerie atmosphere. Shafts of light streamed through the cracks in the boarded-up windows, casting long shadows that seemed to shift and twist as we moved through the space. "Where do we start?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Elliot scanned the room, his keen eyes taking in every detail. "Look for anything that seems out of place," he said. "Hidden compartments, recent disturbances." Daniel wouldn't have picked this location without a reason. We split up, each of us methodically searching the printing press for clues. I ran my fingers along the edges of desks and drawers, looking for signs of tampering. Every creak of the floorboards and every gust of wind that rattled the windows sent a shiver down my spine, but I forced myself to focus. This place held secrets, I was sure of it, and we had to uncover them before whoever had taken the tape caught up to us. It was Elliot who found the first clue. He called me over to a corner of the room where an old printing press stood, its metal surface tarnished and covered in a thin layer of dust. At first glance, it seemed unremarkable, just another relic of a bygone era. But as Elliot pressed a hand against its side, it shifted slightly, revealing a hidden panel. "Help me with this," he said, motioning for me to grab the other side. Together, we pried the panel open, revealing a small compartment hidden within the base of the machine. Inside was a stack of papers, neatly folded and tied together with twine. Elliot pulled them out carefully, his eyes narrowing as he examined them. "What is it?" I asked, leaning over his shoulder to get a better look. He didn't answer right away, his focus entirely on the documents in his hands. As he flipped through the pages, I caught glimpses of handwritten notes, diagrams, and what appeared to be financial records. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and laced with tension. "It's a ledger," he said. "Payments, transactions, names. This is a record of everything they've done. Every bribe, every deal, every cover-up." I felt a surge of hope, tempered by a deep sense of dread. This was exactly what we'd been looking for, evidence that could expose the corruption Daniel had uncovered. But it was also a target painted squarely on our backs. Before I could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed through the building, sharp and purposeful. My heart leapt into my throat as Elliot's expression hardened. He shoved the ledger into his coat and motioned for me to stay quiet. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until a shadow appeared in the doorway. It was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in a dark suit that did little to disguise the menace in his stance. He wasn't alone. Two others flanked him, their hands resting on the holsters at their sides. "Gentlemen," the man said, his voice smooth and dripping with condescension, "I believe you've found something that doesn't belong to you." Elliot stepped forward, his posture calm but his eyes cold as ice. "Funny," he said, his tone cutting. "I was about to say the same to you." The tension in the room was electric. Every muscle in my body coiled like a spring as I stood frozen behind Elliot. The man's gaze shifted to me briefly, a predatory smile curling at the corners of his mouth. "I suggest you hand over the documents," he said, his voice taking on a harder edge. "It'll save us all a lot of trouble." Elliot didn't flinch. "You should know by now," he said coolly. "Trouble's my specialty." The man's smile faded, replaced by a look of cold determination. He motioned to his accomplices, who began to close in, their movements calculated and deliberate. My pulse pounded in my ears as I glanced around, searching for anything that could serve as a weapon or an escape route. Elliot, however, seemed unfazed. In one fluid motion, he reached into his coat and drew his revolver, the barrel trained steadily on the man in the suit. "I wouldn't," he said, his voice low and deadly. The room fell silent, the tension so thick it was almost suffocating. For a moment, no one moved, each side waiting for the other to make the first move. My hands balled into fists at my sides, my heart racing as I braced for what felt like an inevitable confrontation. But then, to my astonishment, the man in the suit chuckled, a low, humorless sound that sent a chill down my spine. "You've got guts, I'll give you that," he said. "But this isn't over. Not by a long shot." With that, he turned and motioned for his men to follow. They backed away slowly, their eyes never leaving Elliot, before disappearing into the shadows. As the sound of their footsteps faded, I released the breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. Elliot lowered his revolver, his expression unreadable as he turned to face me. "Let's get out of here," he said quietly. "We've got work to do." We left the printing press in silence, the weight of what had just transpired pressing heavily on my shoulders. As we stepped out into the pale morning light, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that the shadows themselves were conspiring against us. But despite the fear gnawing at the edges of my resolve, one thing was clear. We had the evidence we needed, and we weren't going to stop until the truth was laid bare. The drive back to Elliot's office felt heavier than ever. The ledger, now tucked safely in his coat, radiated importance, the kind that could either illuminate the path ahead or bury us under the weight of danger it threatened to expose. Elliot's unwavering focus behind the wheel told me as much. His silence was both a reassurance and a warning, the quiet before a storm. The streets of Boston passed us by in somber procession, their brick facades whispering secrets that seemed older than time. I watched the damp shadows slither along alleyways, their presence unbroken by daylight. My thoughts churned, unable to settle on one question for too long. Who were those men? Why hadn't they pressed harder? And most importantly, why did Daniel's investigation mean so much to these faceless puppeteers lurking in the wings? Elliot didn't slow as we approached the office, his actions swift and deliberate. He locked the car with practiced ease and led the way, his steps brisk and purposeful on the cracked pavement. I followed, barely catching my breath as the chill of the mid-morning air wrapped around us, heavy with the hint of rain. Inside, the atmosphere shifted almost immediately. The cluttered yet functional space was exactly as we'd left it. Maps pinned to the walls, the faint smell of old paper blending with the aroma of coffee still lingering from last night. It was a haven of sorts, a refuge where Elliot's sharp mind and fierce determination turned chaos into clarity. Elliot placed the ledger on the desk with a reverence I hadn't seen before. He leaned over it, carefully untying the twine that bound its worn pages together. I stepped closer, my heart pounding in rhythm with his deliberate movements. Names, dates, amounts, Elliot murmured as his eyes scanned the entries. Every transaction, every payoff meticulously recorded. This is more than evidence. It's a confession. I swallowed hard, the weight of his words pressing into my chest. It's dangerous, I said softly, voicing the thought that had lingered since the printing press. Dangerous for Daniel, dangerous for us. Elliot nodded, his gaze never wavering. That's why we need to move quickly. The longer we hold onto this, the bigger the target on our backs. His voice was steady, resolute, yet there was an undercurrent of urgency that I couldn't ignore. As Elliot worked through the ledger, his keen eyes dissecting every entry, I turned my attention to the room. I picked up the journal that had first pointed us towards Site B, flipping through its pages in search of connections. My background as a history teacher gave me a unique perspective, patterns, codes, and the human motivations behind every decision often spoke to me in ways they couldn't to Elliot. I paused on a page filled with geometric shapes and annotations that looked almost like a map. It struck me as odd. The placement of the shapes seemed deliberate, as though they represented specific locations. Elliot, I said, holding the journal toward him. Take a look at this. He glanced up, his sharp features marked by intrigue. He took the journal from my hands, his eyes narrowing as he studied the page. Coordinates, he muttered. These aren't just symbols, they're markers. Daniel wasn't mapping ideas. He was mapping territory. Excitement mingled with apprehension as I leaned closer. Could these be the sites he was fighting to protect? More pieces of the puzzle. Elliot nodded, his mind clearly working at lightning speed. It's possible. If we cross-reference these markers with the ledger, we might find something: connections, motives, patterns. I felt a surge of hope tempered by the lingering dread that had shadowed every step of our investigation. The puzzle was beginning to take shape, but the stakes were higher than ever. Whoever had orchestrated Daniel's murder wouldn't let us uncover the truth without a fight. We worked in near silence, the air heavy with concentration as we pieced together the fragments of Daniel's investigation. Hours passed unnoticed, marked only by the occasional scrape of a chair or the rustle of paper. Elliot's meticulous nature guided us forward, his relentless pursuit of answers pushing through the obstacles that seemed designed to deter us. Finally, Elliot spoke, his voice cutting through the stillness. Here, he said, pointing to an entry in the ledger. A payment made to a councilman 2 months ago, large enough to raise eyebrows if it had gone through legitimate channels. I stepped closer, peering at the name listed beside the payment. Gerald Withers. The name didn't immediately register, but the connection to city politics was undeniable. What does it mean? I asked, my voice a mix of curiosity and apprehension. Elliot's expression darkened. It means someone's pulling strings, and it's someone with the power to manipulate the city from the inside. We need to find Withers. The thought sent a shiver down my spine. The idea of confronting someone entrenched in the web of corruption was daunting, yet necessary. Daniel's ledger was more than just evidence. It was a guide, a means to follow the trail that would lead us to the truth. Before we could delve further, the office phone rang, its shrill tone cutting through the quiet. Elliot answered, his voice sharp and professional. "Brooks." I watched as his expression shifted, the subtle hardening of his jaw telling me the caller wasn't delivering good news. "Understood," he said finally, his tone clipped. He hung up and turned to me, his eyes like ice. "We've been compromised," he said. "Someone knows we have the ledger." The weight of his words settled over me like a suffocating blanket. "How?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "The men at the printing press, silent witnesses to our discovery, now moving against us." Elliot didn't respond immediately. Instead, he grabbed his coat and motioned for me to follow. "We need to move. If we stay here, we'll be sitting ducks." The urgency in his voice propelled me forward, my fear kept at bay by the sheer force of his resolve. As we stepped out into the chilly afternoon air, the city around us felt darker, more foreboding. The quiet hum of life seemed distant, muffled by the threat that loomed over us like a storm. "We'll go to Susan," Elliot said, his tone firm. "She's not safe, not now. We need to get her out." The thought of Susan, fragile yet determined, gave me pause. I couldn't bear the idea of her becoming a pawn in this dangerous game, yet I knew Elliot was right. She was as much a target as we were, her connection to Daniel making her a liability in the eyes of those we sought to expose. As we climbed into the car, the weight of the ledger pressed heavily in my thoughts. It was more than evidence, it was a weapon, one that could either save us or destroy everything we were fighting for. And as Elliot started the engine, his expression set in stone, I couldn't shake the feeling that the walls were closing in around us. Elliot's knuckles whitened as he gripped the steering wheel, his eyes fixed on the road with a focus I'd come to recognize as both his shield and his weapon. The ledger sat in the bag at his feet, a ghostly presence reminding us of the lines we had crossed and the danger we were barreling toward. My chest felt tight, the hum of the engine a steady backdrop to the silence that hung between us like a coiled snake. We were on our way to Susan's apartment. Elliot had insisted we couldn't leave her unguarded, not with the men from the printing press looming in the shadows. I tried to keep my thoughts rational, tried to calm the churn in my stomach, but every breath felt heavier. Every mile closer pulled the tension taut in my veins. When we reached her building, a modest brick structure that seemed as worn and weary as the city itself, I could feel the weight of the decisions we were making pressing against my ribs. Elliot parked on the street, quickly scanning the surrounding area before motioning for me to follow. Susan's apartment was on the third floor, accessed by a narrow staircase that creaked under each step. The dim lighting of the hallway did nothing to dispel the unease that had taken root deep in my chest. Elliot knocked on her door firmly, his stance as steady as ever. It took a moment, but eventually, the door cracked open to reveal Susan's pale face. Her eyes darted between us, searching for answers in our expressions. Without a word, she stepped aside, letting us in. Inside, the apartment was sparse but tidy. The modest furniture and faded curtains spoke of a life lived carefully, without indulgence. Susan lingered by the window, her arms wrapped tightly around herself as though she were trying to hold everything together. "What's happening?" she asked, her voice trembling. Elliot didn't mince words. "They know we have the ledger," he said. "We're not safe here." Susan's eyes widened, her face losing what little color it had. "What do you mean? Who knows?" I stepped forward, trying to soften the impact of Elliot's bluntness. "The men at the printing press, they work for whoever orchestrated Daniel's murder. They saw us take the ledger." She sank into the chair by the window, her hands shaking as she grasped the armrests. "What do we do?" Elliot's jaw tightened, his mind clearly racing as he formulated a plan. "We need to keep you safe," he said. "Miguel and I will draw them away. They're after the ledger, not you. But we need you to stay hidden in the meantime." The fear in Susan's eyes was almost unbearable, but she nodded, her resolve shining through the trembling of her hands. "I'll do whatever it takes." Elliot turned to me. His expression hardened into the mask of determination I'd seen so many times before. "Let's move," he said. The plan was simple but risky. We would lead the men away from Susan, using the ledger as bait to lure them into the open. The thought of putting ourselves directly in their path was unnerving, but Elliot's confidence left little room for doubt. We drove to the outskirts of the city, to an abandoned warehouse Elliot knew from a previous case. The location was secluded, the perfect place to confront our pursuers without putting innocent lives at risk. The sun was beginning to set as we pulled into the gravel lot, the shadows stretching long and thin across the ground. Elliot parked the car near the entrance, his movements calm and deliberate. He reached for the ledger and handed it to me, his piercing blue eyes locking onto mine. "Stay close to me," he said. "No matter what happens." I nodded, my throat tight with the weight of the unspoken words between us. Elliot stepped out of the car, his posture rigid as he scanned the area. I followed, the gravel crunching under my boots as I tried to steady my breathing. The warehouse was a towering structure of rusted metal and broken windows, its interior shrouded in darkness. Elliot led the way inside, his steps silent as he navigated the maze of crates and debris. I stayed close, my pulse pounding in my ears as the eerie stillness enveloped us. Minutes passed like hours, every creak of the building amplifying the tension in the air. I could feel the weight of the ledger in my hands, its presence a constant reminder of the danger we were courting. Then, the sound of footsteps echoed through the space. Elliot stiffened, his hand instinctively brushing the edge of his coat where his revolver rested. I gripped the ledger tighter, my eyes darting toward the source of the noise. 3 figures emerged from the shadows, their movements purposeful and menacing. The man in the suit from the printing press was at the forefront, his cold eyes scanning the room before settling on Elliot. "Well, well," he said, his voice smooth and mocking. "Detective Brooks, you've been busy." Elliot didn't respond, his stance unwavering as he stared down the man. "And you must be Vasquez," the man continued, his gaze shifting to me. "The loyal sidekick. Tell me, does it pay well?" I felt the anger rise in my chest, but Elliot's subtle gesture kept me in check. He stepped forward, his presence commanding as he addressed the man. "You're looking for the ledger," Elliot said, his voice steady. "Here it is." He motioned for me to hold it up, and the man's eyes gleamed with satisfaction. "Smart move," he said. "Hand it over, and we'll make this quick." Elliot shook his head, his expression cold as steel. "Not so fast. You want the ledger? You answer my questions first." The man's smile faded, replaced by a look of irritation. "You're in no position to negotiate, Brooks." "Then take it," Elliot said, his voice low and daring. The tension snapped like a coiled spring. The man lunged forward, his accomplices following suit. Elliot moved with precision, drawing his revolver and firing a warning shot that echoed through the warehouse. I ducked behind a stack of crates, clutching the ledger as chaos erupted around me. The men scattered, their shouts mixing with the sound of gunfire and crashing debris. Elliot moved like a shadow, his martial arts expertise turning the confined space into a battlefield of his design. I scrambled to my feet, adrenaline surging as I searched for an opening. The ledger was the key. If they took it, everything Daniel had fought for would be lost. Elliot called out to me, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Miguel, the back exit." I didn't hesitate. Clutching the ledger, I darted toward the rear of the warehouse, weaving through the maze of crates and shadows. The sound of footsteps pursued me, but I pressed forward, the weight of the truth driving me onward. When I reached the exit, the cold night air hit me like a slap to the face. I turned to see Elliot emerge behind me, his revolver raised as he backed out of the warehouse. The men didn't follow, their shouts fading into the distance as we made our escape. Elliot's expression was grim as he turned to me, his breathing heavy but controlled. "Let's go," he said. "This isn't over." As we climbed into the car and sped away, the city lights flickered in the distance, a reminder of the shadows that still lurked behind us. Despite the danger, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were closer to the truth, and that the cost would be higher than we'd ever imagined. The streets of Boston blurred under the pale glow of street lamps as Elliot drove, his focus razor-sharp. The air in the car was thick with unspoken tension, a raw energy that seemed to vibrate through every creak of the wheels and rumble of the engine. The ledger sat in the back seat, an innocuous-looking pile of paper that carried the weight of so many lives. Daniel's, Susan's, ours. Its presence gnawed at me as though it were a living thing, its burden far heavier than its physical weight. The city outside seemed different now, colder, darker, more watchful. Perhaps it was the danger that loomed over us, sharpening every shadow into the silhouette of a threat. Or perhaps it was the knowledge that this city, whose history I had come to love and teach, had darker truths buried beneath its brick and mortar. Elliot broke the silence. "We'll use the safe house," he said, his voice steady but low. "It's out of the way, secure. We can regroup there and figure out our next move." I nodded, clutching the strap of my bag tightly. My mind raced with questions, calculations, fears I couldn't quite name. "Do you think they'll follow us there?" I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. "They'll try," Elliot replied without missing a beat. His tone held no fear, no hesitation, just the cold clarity of a man who had walked this tightrope before. "But they won't find us." I wanted to believe him. I wanted to trust his instincts, his unshakable resolve. But the echoes of gunfire still rang in my ears, and the image of those men, hunters in the shadows, refused to leave my mind. When we arrived at the safe house, it was as unassuming as I expected. A small, worn-down townhouse tucked in a quiet neighborhood that seemed untouched by the chaos unraveling elsewhere in the city. Elliot led the way inside, his movements as methodical as ever, checking the locks and windows before motioning for me to follow. The interior was sparse but functional. A few pieces of mismatched furniture sat scattered around the living room, their edges softened by years of wear. The faint smell of dust and wood polish hung in the air, and the soft hum of a refrigerator broke the silence. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Elliot gestured toward the dining table. "Spread out the documents," he said. "We need to take a closer look at everything we have: ledger, journal, maps." Something in here will point us in the right direction. I didn't argue. I unpacked the contents of my bag, laying the papers out in neat rows across the table. The ledger was our centerpiece, its pages open to the carefully documented transactions that had started this whole mess. Around it, the pages of Daniel's journal and the hand-drawn maps formed a web of information that seemed both overwhelming and tantalizingly close to revealing its secrets. Elliot sat opposite me, his gaze darting between the documents with the intensity of a chess master calculating his next move. "Start with the names," he said, tapping the ledger. "Council members, business owners, anyone who's tied to these payments." I scanned the list, my fingers tracing the carefully inked entries. Each name felt like a puzzle piece, a fragment of a picture that refused to come into focus. "Here," I said, pointing to one of the names, Gerald Withers. "We saw this name at the warehouse," I continued, my voice steadying as my mind began to piece things together. "He's a councilman, right? Connected to the Urban Renewal Initiative." Elliot nodded, his eyes narrowing. "Withers is dirty, that much is clear. But he's not working alone. Follow the trail. Who's paying him? Who stands to gain the most from this?" I flipped the page, revealing another entry that caught my attention. The name was unfamiliar, but the amount, staggering in its boldness, made it clear this was no ordinary transaction. The initials HH were scrawled beside it, along with a notation, Project B Expansion. "HH," I said aloud, my brow furrowing. "Any idea who that could be?" Elliot leaned back, his fingers drumming lightly against the edge of the table. "Could be a corporation, could be an individual. Either way, it's someone high enough up the chain to be pulling strings." The room fell quiet again as we worked, the occasional rustle of paper the only sound. I felt the hours slip by, the weight of our task pressing heavily against my shoulders. The pieces were there, scattered across the table like fragments of a shattered mirror. But the picture they formed remained just out of reach, distorted by the lies and shadows that had brought us here. The silence was shattered by the shrill ring of Elliot's phone. He answered it quickly, his tone sharp and businesslike. "Brooks." I watched his expression shift as he listened, his jaw tightening with each passing second. When he hung up, his eyes met mine, and I knew whatever he'd heard wasn't good news. "That was Withers," he said, his voice like steel. "He wants to meet." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. "He called you directly?" I asked, my stomach twisting with unease. Elliot nodded. "He knows we have the ledger, says he wants to make a deal." "And you believe him?" "No," Elliot said flatly. "But if he's desperate enough to reach out, he's on the verge of breaking. That makes him dangerous and vulnerable." I didn't like it. Every instinct screamed that this was a trap, a calculated move by someone who had already proven their willingness to kill to protect their secrets. But Elliot's resolve was unshakable, and I knew better than to try to talk him out of it. "When?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Tonight," Elliot replied. "An abandoned hotel downtown. Neutral ground," he says. A chill ran down my spine as I imagined the meeting, the shadows that would inevitably gather around us like vultures circling their prey. But there was no turning back now. The drive to the hotel was quiet, the city's lights casting long, distorted reflections on the rain-slicked streets. The building itself was a hulking relic of the past, its faded facade and broken windows a stark reminder of Boston's forgotten corners. Elliot parked a block away, his movements as deliberate as ever. He adjusted his coat, his revolver hidden but within easy reach. I followed closely, every step weighed down by the sense that we were walking into the lion's den. Inside, the air was thick with decay, the scent of mildew and neglect clinging to every surface. The lobby was dark, lit only by the faint glow of a single bulb that flickered intermittently. Withers was already there, his figure hunched in the corner like a man weighed down by his own secrets. "You came," he said, his voice a rasp that carried both relief and fear. Elliot didn't respond immediately. He stepped closer, his posture commanding as he loomed over the councilman. "Talk," he said, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. Withers shifted nervously, his hands fidgeting as he spoke. "It's bigger than you think," he said, his words tumbling out in a rush. "The Urban Renewal Initiative, the payments, it's all part of a larger plan. He's the one pulling the strings. The sound of a gunshot tore through the air, cutting him off mid-sentence. I froze as Withers slumped forward, blood pooling beneath him. Elliot was already moving, his revolver drawn as he scanned the shadows. "They're here," he said, his voice low and steady. "Stay behind me." I obeyed, my heart racing as the sound of footsteps echoed through the building. The walls seemed to close in around us, every shadow a potential threat. But through the fear, one thought burned bright and clear. The truth was close, so close we could almost touch it. The echo of the gunshot still rang in my ears as Elliot took point, his revolver raised and eyes scanning the dim, crumbling room. I pressed my back to the damp plaster wall, feeling the cold seep through my coat as my heart pounded wildly against my ribs. Withers' body lay slumped over the chair, his blood pooling beneath him in a dark, spreading stain. The acrid tang of gunpowder hung in the air, and the sudden silence felt unnatural, as though the world itself had frozen in shock. Elliot's voice was low but sharp, cutting through the tension like a blade. "They're still here." I nodded, my throat dry as I clutched the edge of the ledger against my chest. My hands were trembling, not just from fear but from the crushing weight of realization. Whoever was, whoever was orchestrating this nightmare, they were closing in, and they weren't going to let us walk away with the truth. Elliot motioned for me to follow, his movements precise and deliberate as he advanced toward the shadows at the far end of the room. The flickering light from the bare bulb above Withers' lifeless form threw shifting shadows across the cracked walls, distorting our surroundings into a maze of uncertainty. Footsteps echoed faintly from the adjoining hall, deliberate but unhurried. The sound sent a chill down my spine. They weren't running. They knew we were trapped. Elliot turned his head slightly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Stay behind me. Stay close." I obeyed, my pulse hammering in my ears as I followed him into the corridor. It was narrow and suffocating, the exposed brick walls pressing in on either side. Each step we took felt heavier than the last, the weight of Withers' unfinished confession and the unknown threat ahead suffocating my resolve. Then, a low voice broke the silence, smooth and dripping with malice. "Detective Brooks, you've been a thorn in my side for far too long." The figure stepped into view, illuminated by the faint light filtering through a broken window. It was the man in the suit, the same one from the printing press. His posture was relaxed, almost casual, but the cold steel glinting in his hand betrayed his intentions. Behind him, two other men flanked him, their expressions impassive but their weapons drawn. Elliot didn't waver. He held his ground, his revolver steady as his icy blue eyes locked onto the man in the suit. "You've killed to keep your secrets," Elliot said, his voice as sharp as the tension crackling between them. "But it ends here." The man chuckled, a low and humorless sound that sent a shiver down my spine. "Bold words, detective," he said, "but you're outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and out of time. That ledger belongs to us." Elliot tilted his head slightly, his grip on the revolver unwavering. "Funny thing about numbers," he said. "They don't mean much when you don't know how to use them." And then he moved. It happened faster than I could process. Elliot's first shot rang out, the deafening crack echoing through the corridor as the man in the suit dove to the side. Chaos erupted as the other men returned fire, the sharp bark of gunshots filling the confined space. I dropped to the ground instinctively, my heart racing as I crawled behind a stack of debris for cover. The ledger was still clutched tightly against my chest, its edges digging into my skin as though it, too, knew the stakes of this moment. Elliot was a blur of motion, his precision and discipline evident even in the chaos. He ducked and weaved through the corridor, his revolver barking as he returned fire with deadly accuracy. One of the men went down, clutching his leg as he cried out in pain. I peeked out from behind my cover, my mind racing. I had to do something. I couldn't just sit there while Elliot fought alone. My eyes landed on a rusted metal pipe lying nearby, half buried in a pile of rubble. It wasn't much, but it was all I had. Gritting my teeth, I grabbed the pipe and forced myself to move. My legs felt like lead as I pushed forward, staying low and keeping to the shadows. One of the gunmen had his back to me, his focus entirely on Elliot. Before I could second-guess myself, I swung the pipe with all the strength I could muster. The dull clang of metal meeting bone reverberated through my arms as the man crumpled to the ground, his weapon clattering uselessly out of reach. Elliot glanced back at me, a flicker of surprise in his otherwise steely expression. "Good timing," he muttered, his voice tight as he turned his attention back to the remaining threat. The man in the suit had retreated to the far end of the corridor, his posture tense but his confidence unshaken. His gaze shifted between Elliot and me, calculating his next move. "You think this changes anything?" he sneered. "The truth doesn't matter when no one's left to tell it." Elliot's eyes narrowed, his revolver trained squarely on the man. "The truth always matters," he said, "and you won't be around to stop it." The final shot rang out, a sharp crack that seemed to split the air itself. The man in the suit staggered, his expression one of disbelief as he slumped against the wall. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of my own ragged breathing. Elliot lowered his weapon slowly, his shoulders rising and falling as he exhaled. I stepped forward hesitantly, my legs shaky but steady enough to carry me to his side. "Is it over?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Elliot didn't answer right away. His gaze lingered on the fallen man, a mixture of triumph and something deeper, a flicker of sorrow, perhaps, or weariness. Finally, he turned to me and nodded. "For now." I clutched the ledger tightly, its pages stained with dirt and sweat but intact. The fight wasn't over, not completely. But in that moment, standing in the shadows of the crumbling building, I felt a spark of hope. We had survived, and the truth was still ours to tell. The city was waking when we returned to the safe house. Pale light filtered through the cracked blinds, casting long, jagged shadows across the room. The ledger sat on the table between us, its pages open and damning. Every name, every transaction, every lie meticulously recorded. This was it, the foundation of the conspiracy that had cost Daniel Carter his life. Yet as I stared at it, the weight of what it represented pressed down harder than ever. Elliot stood by the window, his figure framed by the soft glow of the rising sun. His shoulders were tense, but his posture was unyielding. He held his revolver loosely at his side, a silent reminder of the lines we had crossed to get here. He had been quiet since the confrontation at the hotel, his icy blue eyes fixed on the world outside as though searching for something or someone. "We need to move quickly," Elliot said, breaking the silence. His voice was steady, but there was an edge to it, a sense of urgency that mirrored my own. "Whoever's left in this operation won't back down. If we don't act now, they'll bury this." I nodded, my throat tight as I flipped through the ledger. The names blurred together, each one a piece of a larger, darker puzzle. "So, what's the plan?" I asked, my voice quiet but firm. Elliot turned to face me, his eyes sharp and calculating. "We go public," he said. "Find a journalist, someone with the reach and the guts to put this out there. Once it's in the hands of the people, there's no taking it back." The thought sent a shiver through me. The power of truth was undeniable, but it was also dangerous. "And then what?" I asked, unable to keep the fear from creeping into my voice. Elliot's gaze softened slightly, and for a moment, I saw the man behind the steel, the friend who had fought beside me every step of the way. "Then we finish what Daniel started," he said, "no matter the cost." Elliot's contact came through faster than I expected. Her name was Clara Ruiz, an investigative journalist with a reputation for taking down untouchable giants. We met her in an unassuming diner on the outskirts of the city, the kind of place where no one asked questions as long as you paid for your coffee. Clara was sharp, both in appearance and demeanor. Her dark eyes scanned the room as she slid into the booth across from us, her every movement deliberate. She listened intently as we laid out the story, her expression growing darker with every word. When we presented the ledger, she didn't flinch. Instead, she leaned forward, her fingers tracing the entries as though she could feel the weight of the secrets they held. "This is explosive," Clara said finally, her voice measured but laced with determination. "If what you're saying is true, this could bring down half the city council and the corporations funding them." "It's true," Elliot said, his tone leaving no room for doubt. "Every word, every name. But if we're going to do this, we need to move fast. Once they know we're coming, they'll do everything they can to shut us down." Clara nodded, her jaw tightening. "I'll get this to my editor," she said. "We'll verify the information, cross-check the sources. But once we run this, there's no going back." Elliot leaned back, his expression unreadable. "There never was," he said simply. The next 24 hours were a blur of movement, anticipation, and fear. Clara worked tirelessly, her team unraveling the threads of the conspiracy with a precision that was both impressive and unsettling. Every piece of the puzzle fell into place, each connection building toward a picture so damning it left no room for denial. Elliot and I stayed in the background, watching as the truth unfolded before us. I couldn't help but think of Daniel, of the life he had dedicated to exposing these lies. This was his legacy, his fight, and now it was ours. When the story broke, it was like a thunderclap. The headlines screamed across every major outlet. Asterisk corruption exposed. Boston's leaders tied to criminal conspiracy. Asterisk the names were there, laid bare for the world to see. The Urban Renewal Initiative was revealed for what it truly was: a calculated campaign of greed and control, orchestrated by the powerful and paid for with the lives of those who dared to resist. The city erupted. Protests filled the streets, voices rising in defiance as people demanded accountability. The council members named in the ledger were arrested, their carefully constructed facades crumbling under the weight of public outrage. The corporations involved faced investigations that threatened to dismantle their empires. Through it all, Elliot remained a constant, calm, focused, and resolute. He watched from the sidelines as the dominoes fell, his expression unreadable. I knew better than to press him for his thoughts. He would speak when he was ready. It was late at night when we returned to the Freedom Trail. The cobblestone path was empty, the lanterns casting soft pools of light that seemed to shimmer with the weight of history. Elliot walked ahead of me, his steps deliberate but unhurried. "This is where it started," he said, his voice low, "and this is where it ends." I nodded, my gaze drifting toward the Old North Church in the distance. The memory of that night, the blood, the fear, the overwhelming sense of loss, washed over me like a tide. But now there was something else: hope. "You think Daniel would be proud?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Elliot turned to me, his icy blue eyes softening just slightly. "He would be," he said, "but he'd remind us there's still work to do." We stood there in silence, the weight of the past and the promise of the future intertwining around us. The city was waking again, its lights brighter, its voices louder. The shadows still lingered, but they no longer held dominion over the truth. As the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in weeks. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, I believed we had a chance. Elliot glanced at me, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Ready, Miguel?" I smiled, the weight in my chest lifting just enough to let me breathe. "Always."